For more on all of this, let's hear from our panel. Joining me now from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institution. With me here in the studio is Sourabh Gupta. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Joining us from New Delhi is Zorawar Daulet Singh. He is a fellow at the Center for Policy Research in India. And with us here too in Washington is Zhang. He is chief correspondent in the Washington Bureau for the Shanghai Wenhui Daily. Welcome to all of you to the show. Qinduo, let me start with you. How significant was this meeting, and did it succeed in resetting relations between China and India, given that relations did take a bit of a dive last year over their border dispute?
Well, that's true, Anand. If you look at, I think, like two levels. On the bilateral level, you see over the past years, there's a growing suspicion, mutual suspicion of each other. On the Chinese side, there's a suspicion about India being dragged into this Indo-Pacific concept somehow that will evolve into becoming somehow like an anti-China camp with the U.S., Japan, and ultimately Australia. On the Indian side, there's also suspicion about the Chinese activity in the Indian Ocean and also in the neighborhood of India in South Asia. And so you need to iron out the differences and reduce those suspicions. And on another level, I think on the global level, you see like the U.S. and other developed countries are increasingly looking inward, as said in the report. There's a rise of protectionism and nationalism, and there's a reduced less development of globalization and free trade. I think that these are the common concerns for China and India, the two largest developing countries. They benefit a lot from globalization and free trade. They want to maintain the trend and push forward globalization.
Zorawar, the Chinese news agency Xinhua said that this meeting underscored mutual cooperation and mutual trust. Prime Minister Modi said the meeting allowed him to have a candid and in-depth exchange with President Xi. How is the meeting being viewed in India rather?
Yes, so it's being viewed certainly as a first step towards lowering the temperature that had sort of gotten heightened in the last 2 years. What most observers are looking at, of course, is what happens on the frontiers. India, of course, has always had a slightly weaker position when it comes to the borders. There's been a whole lot of aggressive patrolling from both the PLA and the Indian Army. They need to sort of settle that temperature down, and we've seen that portion of certainly is something which will see a progress in terms of new confidence-building measures, or certainly implementing some of the older ones. The second strand of this is that a whole set or series of common interests that both countries do have, and they have been giving expression to those, but there has also been a sense of cautiousness and timidity from the Indian side and even perhaps on the Chinese side to truly come together on areas where you can agree on. So we're going to see progress on that front. The point of friction has been the neighborhood, South Asia, the Indian Ocean. So it's encouraging to hear of them, if not coordinating, certainly speaking more honestly and candidly about their policies in this overlapping periphery. So I guess the aspiration would be from moving away from two regional powers sort of rubbing against each other, oblivious of each other's strategic interests, to some form of, if not co-creating a new common neighborhood, certainly listening to the voices around South Asia and Southeast Asia who want stable ties with both India and China. Nobody wants to make choices today. They want a stable, mutually beneficial ties with all rising powers. So if India and China listen to that particular voices that are coming up, right, I think they're obligated to have some sort of stability in their bilateral relationship.
Song, looking at mutually beneficial ties, this meeting was a big focus during this meeting on trade and economic issues. China wants to expand its economy, its export economy. India wants to develop its infrastructure. How does the relationship benefit both countries?
I think this meeting, we will see a beginning of much more closer economic and trade relationship. And we have seen about 88 billion US dollar trade volume in the last year, and in the first quarter of this year, it's about 15 to 20% more. I think in the future, there will be a lot of potential for the two countries to develop. I think India, from one angle, they are not openly accepting this OBOR initiative from China, but they are open to accept a lot of investment from Chinese side or from AIIB. From another side, I think China is having a lot of trade with India, but at this moment, the trade is not very much balanced. And I think China is saying that we are open to import more agriculture, medicine, IT, and other products from India. And especially we have seen one Indian leader was proposing to Chinese side, now you are not importing too much soybean from US, why not to import from Chinese side? I think we are having about 20% of the global GDP at this moment, but we are only having 0.5% of the global trade. So that means we have tremendous potential to achieve in the coming future on trade and economic cooperations.
Sourabh, some have described this meeting as a milestone. What is your assessment?
Well, I wouldn't put it in that category of being a milestone, but I think it's a very, very important meeting from the perspective that they managed, the two parties have basically set a flow under their relationship, which they had begun to do so from the latter part of last year, and now are creating, preparing that foundation for the next step, for the next way forward. I mean, charting a kind of a rise in India-China relationship over the next cycle. Let me put this into a little broader perspective. We've had a cycle of deterioration from, say, it was a decade back, from about 2005 to 2009. They put a floor beneath. Again, they had during the early part of the 2000s, I mean, of the 2010s, the relationship was humming along very, very well. It went down again over the last, I would say, 3 years, not just last year. And again, they've been able to set the floor. Every time they set the floor, they set it at a higher level than what it was previously. So this relationship is moving upwards. And the most important thing coming out of this meeting, I would say, is this. Both parties kind of assured each other that, yes, we have differences and some fundamentally important differences, but the differences in China-India relations remain within China-India relations. It is not for third parties to benefit from that, and that India and China will solve those problems over a period of time. What happens in India-China relations stays within India-China relations.
Qinduo, both these countries have supported globalization. President Xi said China and India are both important engines for global growth, and we are central pillars for promoting a multipolar and globalized world. Does the India-China relationship take on even more significance now, given that Donald Trump's been talking about America first, about an inward-looking America, and at a time when there is a trade dispute between China and the United States?
Well, I think so. If you look at the Indian response to the ongoing China-U.S. trade disputes, there is a fear that India will also suffer because of the unilateral approach by the Trump administration to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum and other products. So India is complaining to Washington about that. And also you can see China and India, they joined other 6 countries against the possible action taken by the European Union side to basically take a careful look at whether there is a dump of steels from other countries, including China, including India. They're mostly targeting at India, but other countries like Chile, South Korea, China, India, they all joined the group against such a possible action, so-called safeguard measures over there. Because people in India and China, they do see this as another like a protectionist measures to be taken by another very important economic body here in the world. So that will contribute somehow to this trend, to this tide of anti-globalization or protectionism. I think both, as I said, both India and China have benefited a lot from the globalization, from free trade, from investment from other countries. And they do see it, continuous trend like this is beneficial to their further economic development, not only mutually, but also around the world. I think in this sense, they do have this commonality. They need to work together. Somehow Asia, represented by the two large developing countries now, is moving in the future in a direction more or less different from that of Washington, even Brussels, I would say.
Zorawar, I want to ask you about a point that Zhang raised a moment ago, and that is India's reluctance to embrace China's signature foreign development initiative. That is the One Belt, One Road initiative. India has expressed concerns over China's involvement in Pakistan on the One Belt, One Road initiative. It is building infrastructure in Pakistan right now. Can this be overcome, or do you see it as an obstacle to improving relations between India and China?
Sure. So let me start by saying that connectivity is something which both countries agree on. They both agree that there needs to be more connectivity in Asia, in South Asia, in Eurasia. So I think in that point, they start with a common ground where they agree upon. So it's the details where there are some differences or some areas which need to be clarified. So as far as the China-Pakistan economic corridor, I think the Indian position is fairly clear. It is a question of sovereignty. So let's put that aside and deal with other aspects of China's connectivity projects and ideas as it relates to South Asia. I think there we might possibly find opportunities for, let's say, what Japan-China is looking at, a case-by-case cooperation, because certainly if there are going to be big infrastructure projects in the Indian subcontinent and the periphery, Indian companies can very well participate in that. You have the BCIM, which is the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor. This is also a connectivity corridor from southwest China into northeast India, coming into the Bay of Bengal. Now that actually predates the BRI as a grand theme, but since it's now been included in that, that's something which the Indian side would like to sort of carry forward and look at some of the details. So we're going to see, let me give you another example. I think there are discussions where they might be looking to cooperate in a project in Afghanistan, for example. Now, Afghanistan also is at some level going to be part of both India's connectivity visions and China. So you're seeing this, both sides straddling their connectivity projects indirectly. I think what the Indian side has not reached that position yet is to formally endorse the BRI. So I think that will require a little more persuasion from the Chinese side to get that kind of symbolic legitimacy. But in terms of practical cooperation, I think we're certainly in a position now after this particular meeting between the two leaders to find common ground and also establish some of the norms and the rules of the road for the types of projects that we want in this part of the region. So you've heard of some projects where, and I think that even the Chinese side is also concerned, where you don't want to pour money down into projects which become unsustainable. Indian side too doesn't want that for some of the smaller neighbors who might not have the capacity to bear these kinds of projects. So there are forms to actually cooperate on the principles that should form the bedrock of connectivity. And once those principles have found common ground, I think both sides can actually do joint ventures. There's no reason why India cannot cooperate with China in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, on a whole range of projects.
I want to follow
Go ahead.
Mr. Singh. And I think after this summit, the kind of announcement from the two governments did not mention OBOR, which means they still have some differences on this issue. But I think China is now realizing it's difficult for them to expect Indian government to officially announce to join this OBOR. But I think China is now focusing more like realistic kind of case-by-case cooperation with India, especially China is proposing OBOR to be cooperating with domestic and regional initiative, regional kind of projects from Indian side. I think that is more realistic.
But Zhang, as China and India try to build better relations, do you think it's going to affect China's relationship with Pakistan in any way?
I think yes and no. Yes means, anti-terrorism is a very important issue from Indian side. And they especially want China to support its effort to fight against terrorism in Kashmir and other areas. But China is now slowly coming to support on specific cases, which may affect its cooperation with Pakistan. But overall, I think generally Pakistan is much more needing China's support. China is also much more interested to work together with Pakistan because of their relationship with America is getting worse.
Okay, we've got to take a break right now. Much more on the China-India relationship when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.